Hello, everybody. Last month, we did quite a controversial show with the anti-big car activist, David Obst, who's based in Southern California. He has a new book out. It's called Saving Ourselves from Big Car. And he made the argument that what he called evil big car, the car industry or the ecosystem of the automotive industry, has killed more people than were killed in World War II. I was naturally a little bit skeptical, and we had an interesting conversation, particularly on electric vehicles, which he is against because he thinks the batteries are as destructive as gasoline. That's another question. We are continuing our conversation about the supposed evils of big car with two guests today who have an intriguing new book out, very much linked, I think, with Obst's new book. It's called Roadkill: Unveiling the True Cost of Our Toxic Relationship with Cars. David Obst is based in Southern California. The two authors of Roadkill are based in the United Kingdom, Henrietta Moore and Arthur Kay, although Arthur is also talking to us from New York. The book is out today. Congratulations to you both on Roadkill. Perhaps, Henrietta, we might begin with you. This idea of cars having a true cost, what does that mean? Is that a quantitative cost? Is that a philosophical one?
It's both. We quantify it in the book in a number of ways, and Arthur will probably give you lots of factoids on that in a second or two. But the true cost of it really is understanding what we think the cost of cars is, because people usually think that the cost of their car is whatever they pay for it, which is the big ticket item. But the question is, how much are you actually paying in other ways? So insurance, repair, parking fines, all the things that really cost you money. But in addition to that, there's the cost that it's asking for us to pay socially and environmentally. And perhaps you talked about that last time when you were talking to Bill. But the issue here is, do we really understand how much cars cost us? Or do we just believe that they're really convenient things and we should go on having them as we do?
So, Henrietta, you might introduce yourself, because you've spent a lifetime. I know your current gig is running University College London's Institute for Global Prosperity. Do you see this book as coming out of a long history of, shall we say, fighting for the social good?
Yes, absolutely, it does. And in a way, it's a pleasure to be able to write such a book. And it's really important, I think, at this moment. But I'm the director of the Institute of Global Prosperity. I started my career as a social anthropologist. And I've been working on issues to do with the Global South, with development, with poverty alleviation, with human rights and gender equality and so on for decades and decades. But in the Institute, what we're interested in is, why aren't governments doing more to improve the quality of ordinary people's lives? So there is a lot more that can be done. And why is it that so many people, even in the 21st century and even in the richest countries of the world, are finding life so unlivable? So cost of energy, cost of housing, cost of food, all of those things.
Let's get to Arthur. Arthur, you come to this more as, what would you describe yourself as, a social entrepreneur?
Yeah, I'd say something along those lines. I trained as an architect and then spent most of my career building two businesses, one called BioBean, one called Skyrim, both kind of involved in how you can make life in cities slightly more livable.
And so you both come to this with the idea, the ideal of the city, of urban life, because one of the things that I'm sure a lot of our audience, viewers and listeners will think is, if I live outside the city, how is it conceivable to live without a car?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point, Andrew, and one we flag in the book several times, but one to nail on the head up front. We're talking very specifically around life in cities in the book, and trying to look at ways in which living with the choice of the car, but not the obligation of the car, can improve quality of life in cities, and everything from the cost of living crisis to not having a premature death, and everything in between. And so there's, we think of the car as, typically because of car adverts, as riding through either empty cities at night. You kind of think of a gleaming BMW kind of going past gleaming buildings with the sun gleaming on the windshield, or we think of it kind of as a driving through the countryside with no one else on the road. But there's roughly 1.6 billion cars in the world, and there's roughly 1 billion of them are in our cities, and almost the large portion of those cars are stuck. They're static because 96% of the time cars are actually sitting somewhere, not moving. And it may feel like whenever you're in a traffic jam that everyone has decided to go down the same street you've got. If you're in San Francisco, Andrew, there'll be a traffic jam, probably at kind of 4 or 5 o'clock today in your neighborhood, and you'll feel like everyone has kind of got up to go at the same time, but actually still most of the time.
That's not true in downtown San Francisco. There's not a lot of traffic because maybe one of the reasons. I'm curious as to what you think on the development of self-driving cars, Waymos, which are now increasingly dominating the streets of San Francisco. They're controversial self-driving cars. Waymo's owned by Google, so it comes with a big tech stamp of approval or disapproval, I guess, how you look at it. But aren't self-driving cars the answer here, Arthur?
Well, we've got strong views on this, but I know you're, as a technologist, Andrew, you've I'm sure got some insights as well that I'd love to hear from yours also. But maybe I'd give my view first, and keen to hear your piece too. We're particularly interested in how self-driving cars can work to reduce the gross tonnage of cars in the world. So let's look at the positives first. They provide an option for shared mobility. So you'll know Kara Swisher, the tech journalist, and she wrote an interesting piece for the New York Times.
A friend of mine, Kara.
And I can imagine. And describing how she'll drive until the day she dies, but the idea of actually owning and garaging a car is dead. And so this idea of moving from access to ownership, from ownership to access, I apologize, being a critical piece of that. And driverless cars are obviously one route to be able to do that. The piece that we're, I guess, more damning about is around two different areas. One is around the surveillance capitalism business model of it. And obviously the reason that people like Google are interested in inventing it is because of the drive for more eyeballs and more attention. And they look
Arthur, that sounds very naive. I mean, the idea of surveillance capitalism was a book that came out many years ago. I actually blurbed it, but Waymo's part of Google. Waymo isn't even part of Google. It's part of Alphabet, and it has an independent business model, which is entirely separate from Google. And even search is kind of going away. So surveillance capitalism, isn't that slightly too simplistic?
Well, I mean, they say so themselves, and I mean, in Alphabet's.
What do you mean they say so themselves?
As in, they don't talk about explicitly surveillance capitalism, but they talk about the idea that their business model is to sell adverts, and they look greedily at the attention.
Yeah, but that's Google. That's not Waymo. Waymo never claims that they're collecting the data of the people who sit in the cars. They don't. I mean, when one sits in a Waymo car, Waymo has no idea of who I am. Certainly not of the other passengers in the car. They have no idea who's in the car. So, but go on. Sorry.
So, we're looking at it from a macro perspective. I mean, in terms of specifically Waymo's business model now, whilst they're still in trial phase in half a dozen cities around the US, is kind of early days. But in terms of why they are interested in that, it's the same reason why Google or Alphabet were interested in sending up hot air balloons to provide internet to some of the poorest people in the global south, not out of some benevolence to try and make everyone's lives better, but because the TAM, the total addressable market of internet users, had been completely saturated, and the only way to grow their TAM was by increasing the number of people online. And so the idea being that last year Americans drove about 17 trillion miles in cars, and that is all time that's very high attention, and it's very kind of very valuable time that could be
I take your point, although I think you're wrong on Google. I don't think you really know what it doesn't. It sounds like you're describing Google rather than Waymo, which is a separate company. But Henrietta,
what's your thoughts, Andrew, on what the
I'm interviewing you. You can interview me on your own show. Henrietta, what's wrong with the idea of Waymo? You sit in a car, they're full of Waymos in San Francisco. We sit in these self-driving cars. They're incredibly safe. way safer than human drivers. We're free to do whatever we like, sleep, do our email, talk to one another. We don't have to watch the road. They behave in a very civil way. Would you agree with Arthur that self-driving cars are not much better than traditional cars?
Well, let's try and break down this argument a bit. Okay, so the first thing is a self-driving car is still a car.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right, so it's taking up the space in the city. It's probably electric. If it's fully electric, then it's got all the problems of electric cars, which you're familiar with. So it's not exactly.
Well, let me get into that, because that was one of the things that.
Hang on a minute, I haven't finished yet.
Go on.
So,
well, you brought up electric cars. I do want to come back to that, but
yeah, you can come back to electric cars. So it's a car. That's its first problem, right? We've got one car on the planet for every 5 people at the moment, and those cars are taking up far too much space. So we need to get rid of that gross tonnage. That's the first problem. The second problem is that cars which are driverless are only as safe as the software. So, you know that as well as anybody else. And there can be all kinds of problems. And anyway, in the big Black Hat Asia cybersecurity event that took place in 2025, there was a lot of stuff about how these cars are not fantastically safe because they can be hacked into. Now, we've already got a whole bunch of people in the world who seem to think that the way to get on with their neighbors is to drive cars into groups of people who are enjoying themselves on the street. So we don't really want to be looking at other ways of having lunatics being able to do the same kind of thing. So I think there are all kinds of arguments we can make about cars and technology. But I think the point that Arthur was trying to make is that what we call the car industrial complex in the book has a reason for keeping cars on the streets in very large numbers, because their job is to make money, whether it's Waymo or whether it's Tesla or whatever it is. So do you know, as a citizen, for example, how much the wool is being pulled over your eyes? And is it being pulled over your eyes at all, or is it not?
Well, let's get to this issue of electric cars, which was one of the areas where David Hobbes was very outspoken and perhaps controversial in his argument that the electric vehicle wasn't in any better. Essentially, the battery is just as bad for the environment as oil-powered cars or petrol-powered cars. We did a show also recently with Bill McKibben. Your book actually got reviewed in the FT alongside Bill's new book, which is called Here Comes the Sun, A Last Chance for the Climate and a Fresh Chance for Civilization. Just to be clear, Bill is not a spokesman for big car. We didn't talk that much about cars, but he is very much sympathetic to the idea of the solar-powered revolution, and particularly of EVs and indeed of e-bicycles. You earlier said, Henrietta, that there are deep problems with electric vehicles. Why, from an environmental point of view? Do you agree with Hobbes that there isn't really ultimately that much environmental difference between an electronic, an EV and a gas-powered car?
No, I don't. I think that's rather glossing things too much. There are loads of differences environmentally. I mean, not least, the question of where all the oil is isn't where all the lithium is. So, the geopolitics of this is utterly different. But I think that the other thing we need to bear in mind is in the book, what we're asking is not, as I've said, whether one is worse than the other. Actually, EVs are obviously better in some straightforward sense than ordinary cars. But the problem is we don't want loads and loads of them all over our streets in the same way that we've all got ordinary cars all over our streets. And we certainly don't want loads and loads of them that are not being driven by individuals who can make decisions. So it's one thing to have a few cars being self-driving in San Francisco at the moment. It would be very, very different if they were all self-driving and no human was in charge of them. Because you would have to assume that those cars were making a decision. So how is that decision being made? And who's behind that decision? Is this a software decision? Is this a risk-averse decision? How is that algorithm running? Who's setting that algorithm? Who's responsible for it? So there are all those kinds of questions to be answered. But I think that the thing I'm concerned about in the book is when we think about fossil fuels or indeed about lithium, how much responsibility do we, sitting in London or San Francisco or New York or Jakarta or Shanghai have for thinking about people who live at a great distance from us. So historically, we've been happy to develop the car without having any thought for anybody who's living next to an oil well, even if that oil well's in the United States, or Canada. But nowadays, if we're ruining the Atacama Desert, do we have any kind of moral responsibility, any of us, for trying to develop technologies? Because we're living in the 21st century now. This isn't a gold rush situation. It isn't the 19th century anymore, where we can just walk into someone else's country and extract what we want, and who cares what the consequences are. So those are the kinds of things that I think are different.
David, so perhaps, sorry, Arthur, we may get into the geopolitics. Henrietta talks about walking into the Atacama Desert and taking the lithium or the other rare mineral that's required for making batteries. We've actually done a number of shows on that, including a documentary movie made specifically about that. We also did a film we also did a book called Red. Was it Cobalt Red?
Cobalt Red.
Yeah, about the impact. Arthur, in your view, is there a kind of a moral and an environmental equivalence between lithium and oil? Are they essentially as bad as each other, and the geopolitical consequences of, I don't know, invading Iraq versus colonizing Congo, are they basically the same thing in your view?
I wouldn't go say they're the same thing, but it's more a model of extractivism, regardless, and or kind of colonial approach to kind of taking each other's stuff, whether you're paying for it at a low price or whether you're invading a country to do so, is not a model we want to kind of continue. We recognize some of the challenges geopolitically and others, ranging from major foreign wars, ranging from massive human life cost of human life, ranging from polluting our environment, ranging from energy security. I mean, a lot of the reasons that since the kind of lack of popularity of the Middle Eastern wars in the US, onshoring so much oil production and now becoming a net exporter of energy that the US has done is primarily around energy security and being able to control your kind of domestic energy market and some price stability for your citizens as well. So it's not as direct as saying one's better than the other. It's more saying that, are there ways in which we can move away from this extractivist model? And the car is the biggest by some margin consumer of oil, and also soon to be is already the biggest consumer of these rare earth metals as well in terms of their usage of batteries.
Let's talk about China, one of the largest electric vehicle manufacturers now in the world is BYD. Not allowed to be sold in the US, but very popular elsewhere. The Chinese are pioneering solar power electric vehicles, and indeed the extraction, what you call the extraction economy or the extraction economics of lithium, and their involvement in the African in Africa is very controversial. Some people might be listening. Zia Mabani, for example, one of our frequent guests from Singapore, would say, well, you Westerners, you've had your time. Now your argument in Roadkill or in Big Car is essentially a veiled critique of China. China's having its moment. It's pioneering a new kind of car, a new kind of electric energy, as well as perhaps a new kind of diplomacy. Arthur, is there something in that? Are you analysts based in London or New York? Are you really just nostalgic for a Western way of life, which the Chinese are replacing? Arthur?
I think Arthur's frozen.
We've frozen Arthur because it's probably Waymo or the Chinese or Google or some other. Oh, there he is. He's back.
Google
Arthur.
Or Waymo or something. Yeah. Arthur, are you ready to go, or shall I go there?
Why don't you have a shot at that, Henrietta, and then we'll come back to Arthur.
Well, I think, there's lots of conspiracy theories between America and China, and I don't really want to get into all of that. But what I would say is that the key thing that the Chinese are doing is being hugely innovative in regard to the car sector. And they know that there is a great deal of money to be made. But equally, lots of ordinary people in China are still moving around on their bicycles. So the issue for China is really, have they got the balance right? So there are 2 or 3 things to consider there. So one is, how are they generating the electricity that's actually powering the electric cars? So if you want your car to be completely green, it isn't just that it has to be electric and run on a battery, but the way that you generate the energy has also to be green. So China is doing lots in that area in terms of solar power, but equally it's still doing lots in terms of coal-fired power stations. It's trying to do small-scale nuclear. It's doing all kinds of things to try to get the energy transition. And one of the big issues, for example, for the Global South is how many of those Global South countries can actually transition quickly to renewable energy. And if they can't, then actually putting a whole load of electric cars on the road is just actually pumping up the amount of fossil fuel that you're using. So I don't think it's so much about a conspiracy or against China, nor is it we in the West have decided that we want to carry on living our way of life. In fact, one of the things we point out in the book is that the things that are happening, the transformations that are happening, many of the best transformations in the mobility sector are actually coming from the Global South.
Perhaps say something more about what could give a couple of examples of mobility solutions coming from the Global South.
Yeah. So, for example, if you're talking about how do you maintain choice in systems, so take the Kenya Matatu system, for example. So this is a almost just-in-time, on-demand system that works perfectly well. It moves large numbers of people across Nairobi and across many other cities in Kenya. But the point about it is that for a long time from the West, people were looking at this in very informal mobility system and saying, well, it's just not up to scratch. It's not good enough because it's not actually a train system. It's not actually a bus system.
So explain what it is, because I was in Nairobi actually last month. I'm curious.
Great. And did you take a matatu?
No.
Right. So you weren't driving in a car probably. But if you were an ordinary citizen in Nairobi, then the bus routes and the trains no longer go to the places you really need them. So if you want to get home and come in the morning, you would have seen all of those sort of small van type vehicles which move around, and they pick people up where they live and they drop them off where they work. Now that kind of informal system can be improved enormously by taking a digital platform, which has now happened, planning those routes, making them integrate with other routes and other kinds of transport mobility. So lots of Kenyans move around without either needing a car or thinking about a car. But the issue is that when people have become wealthier, the first thing they want to do is buy a car.
Yeah. So again, coming back to those people on those buses, I'm guessing that most of them would dream, at least, or some of them would dream of owning their own car. Are you suggesting that that's not a wise dream? Perhaps most dreams aren't very wise.
Perhaps most dreams aren't very wise, but I think most people probably are dreaming of owning a car. But then the Kenyan city authorities in Nairobi are spending a lot of time thinking about how do you get rid of these appalling traffic jams. So if you were in Nairobi, you would have been in an appalling traffic jam because everybody is. And we can't have a future where we imagine that everybody who's currently sitting on a matatu actually owns a car, because we would have so many cars on the streets of Nairobi at that point that we wouldn't be able to move at all. So what the city needs is clean air, mobility choices, integrated mobility choices, and so on. And they have to do it under considerable financial constraint compared to, say, San Francisco.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to turn this into a Kenya conversation, but the roads in Nairobi were appalling as well, which adds to the chaos. Are we, Arthur, do we have you back? I know you popped off for a second.
Yes, I can hear you, and sorry for the terrible connection.
Let me get to the core of the book. You argue that cars, and I'm quoting from some of the publicity blurbs for the book, that cars have killed 60 to 80 million people since their invention, more than the deaths of World War I and World War II combined. Two questions on that. What exactly does that mean? And secondly, should we be using that kind of language?
Yeah, well, I guess that's looking at it from a direct death perspective. If we look at premature deaths from things like air quality and other means, or people seriously injured, that number would be much, much higher. But that's in terms of direct deaths, and a United Nations figure for that. In terms of the use of the language, you're right, it is provocative and intentionally so. And it's really to try and highlight the proactive decision we're making. the kind of one of the starting points for this book was looking around our city and thinking about the agency that we have in terms of how our cities have been designed. I mean, I grew up in London in the 1990s, and it was an assumption that the way you moved around your city was primarily by car. We are what we call in the book, we're car blind, because it's simply the water that we are swimming in is around cars and car infrastructure. And it was one of the revelations in writing the book was how late a lot of this stuff actually happened. I kind of was in this kind of narrative in my mind that everyone was pootling along, having a terrible time, not being able to get around anywhere because of horses being kind of smelly and expensive. And then Henry Ford came along and everything was awesome after that. And then aren't we lucky to have them? And what I guess we discovered through writing the book was actually the car industrial complex didn't really come into full force until after the end of the Second World War. And it was this American financing and this American model of urbanism that has been exported all over the world and helped redefine and rebuild our cities in their image.
But
really
let me come into that. I mean, so it sounds to me like your argument is against, in many ways, the American city. But when you come to London, I mean, of course, London is full of cars, but it has an excellent public transportation system, certainly excellent compared to anywhere in the United States. People walk a lot. Is the car so central to somewhere like London? I grew up there too, and when I think of London, I think most of all of its public transportation system.
Well, I'm glad I'm a board member of Transport for London, Andrew. So I'm thrilled to hear you say that. I mean, but it's not always been the case. So I mean, even today, I mean, you would think of London as a pretty good public transport city. I would agree with you, and also quite pro walking and cycling and other means of transport. But today, 80% of London's public space is given over to the car through car parking spaces and through car-related infrastructure. So I kind of intuitively agree with you, and that's how I feel. But that's also comparing it to maybe some pretty bad examples in terms of maybe that number's even higher in other places. And it's just that we've given over a large portion of our, knowingly or unknowingly, of our freedoms to the car. So we write in the book a little bit about things like the freedom to roam, about how far kids have been able to wander from their home, and there's a whole bunch of factors around that. But if you look at some of the studies and kind of in terms of when you ask parents what's meaning that they want to stay home, the leading factor, I mean, there's other things like risk of the child being kidnapped, that kind of stuff, but the leading factor is around cars. And
but isn't that
safety.
A degree of paranoia? Is I'm sure the roads were much less safe in the 60s or 70s, and yet parents, for one reason or other, which had nothing to do with the car, were simply more relaxed about letting their kids wander around.
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of contributing factors to it for sure. And I'm maybe thinking, I think the study that I'm referring to here is looking at kind of a 1950s starting point, and then through 4 generations of people living in the same neighborhood in Sheffield, and as that family evolves through that neighborhood. So you're right, 60s, 70s, 80s. There have been different levels of car safety and car standards.
So you talk about public space in London. It's an interesting point about 80% of the public space is given over to cars. So is that 80%, is that car parks? Is that public car parks? Is that what you're calling for? Fewer public car parks or fewer roads?
So it's what I call car blindness. I'm calling to you today from New York, which again would be seen as a pretty anti-car city. There's roughly 54% of households have cars here. So compared to the rest of the US, that's not many at all. The apartment block I'm staying in, if you walk down the street, there are 5, because of the way that the subsidiary roads work, there are 5 long rows of parked cars all the way along the street. And so when we talk about car blindness, we're literally just talking about noticing how many gross tons of car there are in our lives. Those are parked cars. Obviously, then crossing the road, there are other elements of it, and also obviously the infrastructure. So that's the roads are being given over to it. And so, in the US, the extraordinary fact is that there's more housing for cars, i.e., car parking space, than there is housing for people. So we make a whole bunch of decisions, and these are proactive decisions. I guess what Henrietta and I are both trying to emphasize in this book is not that cars are evil and that you're a bad person if you drive one or anything even close to that. What we're saying is that decisions have been made or not made along the road to be able to prioritize or not prioritize cars and car parking spaces and car related infrastructure. The very beginning of what we're trying to suggest with this is be aware of that. Remove car blindness from your life and see where that is all going and how you're choosing to live your life.
So
and how
you talked about this 80%.
Then from that,
public space in a city is given over to a car. Most of that then you're suggesting is on roads or streets which enable parking. Is that the argument?
Yes. So if you were to not have the car, you would need much.
It would liberate, in your view, it would somehow liberate the streets, create more space.
Yeah, of course it would, and it already has, exactly, where it's happened. So New York is a good example. So New York, like every other city, when people started saying, okay, we're going to close certain streets for certain days in the week, or we're going to restrict traffic movement through them, there's a lot of pushback. But the person I like best is the guy from Ljubljana in Slovenia. So when they first started to close the main street past the market in Ljubljana, nobody wanted them to do it. They all wanted to be able to drive to the cafe, get out of the cafe, and go and sit in the cafe. Then when they closed it, they went back and interviewed people a couple of years later and said, so would you like us to reopen the road? And the guy said, why would I want to have a beer sitting next to a car? Okay. So people change their minds about these things once they realize that there is a choice about how you can live. And plenty of people who were against congestion charging in New York, and plenty of people who were against closing streets in New York, now that that has happened, are actually very positively in favor of it. So it's really about the kinds of where you want to live and how we're able to make choices. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in the book is what ordinary people are already doing to kind of reclaim the streets from the car.
And can you give me an example of, I'm quoting you here, I don't quite know who ordinary people are, Henrietta, but I suppose
okay, but I'll tell you. Go on then.
They're not like you and I, ordinary people, but what exactly are they doing to reclaim their streets?
Well, what they're doing is, for example, saying that that they want to be able to move around their neighborhood in new ways. So they're getting together and saying, okay, we are going to restrict car movement, or we're pushing our local authorities so that we can have a lane that goes alongside the road that allows you to rollerblade or to cycle to school. So you can take the example of someone in Barcelona, whom I'm often quote, who said, yes, we used to be in that situation before we had this way of getting to school easily, where we had to jump in the car in the morning, everything was a rush, the kids were in a rush, then we're in the traffic jam, then we go to school, everybody's upset, everybody's trying to get to the school, leave their kids, etc. And said, now my eldest son, who's 9, walks to school by himself with his friends because he's safe to do so. And my younger daughter...
This is in Barcelona.
Yeah, cities all over the world.
It's not your kids, it's ordinary people's kids.
No, it could be my kids, could be my grandson. But I mean, what I mean is, when I say ordinary people, is that you're not actually the local authority. So you're not a council official, or you're not a business, or you're not whatever. It's just people who are living in the area. So you're just residents of the area who are getting together and working with, indeed, local city authorities or with local businesses to try to improve how they can move around the street. And a lot of that also is asking for different things to happen around the planning so that you can actually get small shops back close to you so you can go out in the morning and buy things that you need without having to get in the car and go there. So that's already happening, the sort of de-suburbanization of cities.
Arthur, I'm not sure how much you've researched American cities. I live in San Francisco. There's one very good case, which I think would be a perfect case for your book, about a street in San Francisco called Valencia Street that was re-engineered to include a lot of bicycle lanes and stopped cars and made it illegal to park. And it resulted, it was a local authority initiative that resulted in a significant re-architecture of the street. And then the store owners on Valencia Street fought back. And this actually is bound up in a lot of arguments about why stuff doesn't happen in America, why things aren't being built because of the law and local laws. But the store owners fought back, saying that it actually killed their business. So there was a restaurant owner in particular who was involved in this Valencia Street argument. Ultimately, actually, the electorate of San Francisco reversed these reforms, which I was very sympathetic to. And now we're back to square one in Valencia Street, huge amount of money spent. What about the arguments, Arthur, of restaurant owners who say that if you ban parking on my street, then you're essentially undermining my business? Do they have an argument?
100%. And I think part of it is around if you're trying to do things very quickly and do things to organizations or to people rather than with them. And so if you're trying to simply not try and think through the entire way of moving around a city, and you're just saying, okay, well, you did have car parking and everyone goes out, drives to eat in San Francisco, as an example, and therefore needs a car parking space, and now you're not going to be able to do that, and therefore your business suffers, is what I just give an example of poorly thought through integrated kind of public transit. If you look at places that have thought it through in slightly more detail in terms of central business districts or high retail footfall areas, I mean, examples include Times Square in New York, Las Ramblas in Barcelona, even the center of Tokyo, or indeed we're looking at doing it in Oxford Street in London, is that if you can think it through in a coherent way, joining together businesses, mobility solutions, the urban realm, the public realm around what that part of the city looks and feels like, and also making sure that there are genuinely good alternatives to be able to get there and get out in an affordable, reliable way. Those are the kind of solutions that can work. And when you look at things like that, the stats are pretty compelling. We talk about them in the book and some of the outcomes there, where you have things like the value of the real estate around Times Square and the income for some of those restaurants and shops going up by as much as 34% in the years following pedestrianisation, as examples. So if you're just going to pull out one element and look at it as solely mobility, i.e. the car, and you're going to say, okay, carry on as is, and you're just going to lose that part, then I can see why that could be challenging and not work. But what we're kind of saying is almost the car is excuse the pun, but a vehicle through which to discuss a whole bunch of other things, including how you can make a successful city or a successful place. And the car can be part of that, but shouldn't have to be part of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You bring up Times Square, you bring up Barcelona, you've talked about London. I wonder whether there's a danger, and I mean, another example, of course, and much more about this is the latest decision in Paris to replace cars with bikes and closing motorways, planting thousands of trees. I wonder whether one of the dangers of this, in terms of an unintended consequence, is turning places like Barcelona and Paris and Manhattan and London and San Francisco into increasingly gentrified places where groups of people who are sympathetic to a certain kind of lifestyle of walking and biking and going to local markets enjoy themselves, and they have every right, of course, to enjoy themselves, and I would position myself as part of that culture. And given that we live for better or worse in an age of increasing inequality, the poorer are living outside these cities. It's certainly the case in Paris. It's certainly the case in Barcelona and London and New York. Is there, Henrietta, a danger of this? I'm not suggesting that your appetite for reform is designed to create this ultimate consequence, but could that be an unintended consequence of creating these havens of carlessness in the world?
No, I don't think so. I think it's about how you plan it. I mean, first of all, the exclusion of all of the poorer people in our societies from the centre of the cities is something that we have planned and have done over several decades. And that exclusion is increasingly problematic. So the question is, the solution for the centre of Paris and the rive of the Seine is not going to be the same as what's going on in the banlieue. But when the Olympics were on, the first thing that the French started to think about was what were they going to do for the banlieue? And so they actually moved lots and lots of the regenerative things to do with sport and regenerating local businesses out into the banlieue of Paris, and put in a huge amount of money to changing the transport system, so to make it much more accessible to move from the banlieue into the centre of Paris, and made it much easier for people to get to work by crossing various banlieues on the outskirts of Paris without even going into the centre of Paris. So the French have actually done a lot of thinking about this, and how successful they have been remains to be seen. But in terms of the communities themselves, many of the people who live in those communities, which are in the outer suburbs, or the banlieue as they're called in French, actually really appreciate the fact that something has been done to connect them. Because the other thing is that when you live in the outside area of a city, you don't feel particularly connected to the centre. Now that can work very well if your city is a series of villages. But I think it's quite easy to dismiss any kind of claim for reform by saying none of this reform is going to work for anybody and it's excluding someone.
Well, I didn't say that. I just said that
No,
one of the unintended consequences is of widening the economic and cultural inequalities between the suburbs or the exurbs and the city. So you're not concerned with that at all.
I think one of the things that's gone on in a lot of these cities is precisely putting them back together, creating connectivity across them. And that's what lots of people have been arguing for. So, for example, Los Angeles down the road from you, people
down many roads.
Yes, down many roads, very large roads, very fast roads, right? People in those areas of the suburban areas of Los Angeles, you can't cross a road, you can't walk anywhere. Those cities are increasingly hot. They flood all the time. And that's when you hope that they don't set themselves on fire. So basically what people have been doing there is getting together and saying, okay, we need a different way of moving around this city. So local organizations, local civil society organizations getting together with residents to work out how they can make the back streets between houses safer spaces, greener spaces, walking spaces, to allow themselves to be able to move around the city. And Los Angeles has done a huge amount of that, and also channels now a lot of its water from those green spaces into tanked reservoirs in order to use for other kinds of purposes when it's necessary. So there are a lot of good things.
Los Angeles is a model. I mean, I don't know when the last time you were there. I go there quite often.
Well,
the traffic doesn't seem to be any better than it's ever been.
Well, I don't know. I was there last 2 months ago, but I mean, and I'm a regular visitor. But what I would say is that there are lots of good things that are happening. And if you want to argue about, what happens to ordinary people who are living in banlieue parts or suburban areas of the city, I think we have to look at what's being done in those areas. It's all about location, 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 not about one model that fits everybody.
So Arthur, sorry, we interrupted you.
Sorry, no, but you're right, Andrew, in terms of with the book, we've intentionally tried to look not just at kind of the quote unquote the obvious places like Amsterdam or Copenhagen or Helsinki.
I knew you were going to bring up the Danish card. That's always the danger one. When I know when people bring up Copenhagen, they're on their last legs. But go on.
Exactly. So we proactively
or their last wheels, shall we say?
Exactly. So we proactively looked at places like Los Angeles, like Seoul in South Korea. Like, I mean, an example I love is in the the great state of Texas in Dallas, where in the Southern Gateway Park, they're developing this amazing piece. And I bring this up because you're talking about kind of knitting kind of what are the solutions in some of the suburban or ex-urban areas, and this is a great example of that. There's a highway, the I-35E, between Ewing and Marsalis Avenues, which is currently in the 60s a huge 11 or 12 lane highway cut through southern Dallas. And they've developed a really interesting new typology that is already being replicated around the world, called a cap park, which is essentially building imagine, if you will, Andrew, a long bridge between these two communities and knitting them together again in.
We've lost Arthur again. Brilliant.
Yeah, we've since I've got both of you on, I can jump on you, Henrietta. What about Tempe? We've talked a little bit about Tempe. I talked with David Obst about Tempe, this development near Phoenix, a car-free living experiment. What's your sense of this? Is this the model for suburban America?
Well, it could be. I mean, the point is we need experimentation and we need forward thinking and we need to try a few different things. But what we mostly need to do is to get the people who are living in those areas to be part of the conversation and not just be the recipients of great plans that are thought up by other people.
But coming back to that, and I'm bringing up another example of San Francisco. There's a mile road on the coast, on the Pacific coast, that got closed at the weekends for walkers and bikers. And then there was a local initiative to close it formally. And it was passed. And now there's a massive reaction, and local residents are up in arms. They've recalled their local congressman, and it's become enormously controversial. So there is a strong, whether you like it or not, it's a reality. I'm not sympathetic to it. In fact, I walked on this strip at the weekend. There are many people who are up in arms about the closing of roads. You talk about all these local initiatives, Henrietta, but the other side of the coin is this, maybe we might call it reactionary populism, that suggests that people want to be able to drive their cars wherever they want. They want to be able to park it. They don't want road closures. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, this is what the book is about. I mean, a large part of the book is about what we understand by freedoms. So, for example, when this happens everywhere in the world, but one place it happened was Oxford in England. And there was a person living there who wrote to me the whole time to complain about many things. Let's call him John Oxford. So John Oxford wrote to me all the time saying, "I want to be able to drive
ordinary people, Henrietta. John Oxford."
Yeah, John Oxford. I want to be able to drive anywhere I like.
And you used to be a professor at Oxford, so you weren't an ordinary person, were you?
I wasn't a professor at Oxford, but yes,
Well, you're a professor at Cambridge, over the road.
So he was driving around saying to me, "I want to be able to park anywhere, do what I like. If I want to park there, I don't see why I can't. I don't see why I should have to travel at 20 miles an hour." So what Mr. Oxford had conveniently forgotten is that actually with cars, we already have a number of regulations governing cars. Like you can only drive on one side of the road. You have to stop at red lights. There are all sorts of rules about driving cars, which we've agreed to. And we've agreed them amongst ourselves because we think that it's better for us if we do. So what we say in the book is, okay, so once you've listened to all of the downsides of various things, giving up all the space in your life to cars and the pollution it causes and the other problems, would you like to get together and come up with some ideas about what you would like in your neighborhood? Now, not everybody's done that everywhere, but there are a lot of very good examples across the world where people have. And one of them, which works quite well, for example, again, going back to Barcelona for a second, is the idea that there are these new blocks in Barcelona. And if you live there, you can drive your car in and out as normal. But if you don't live there, you can't just drive through them on your way to go somewhere else, right? You have to take a different route. Now, there's been a lot of protest about these things, but there's also been a lot of positive response. And the citizens of Barcelona are very in favor of their block system. So you have to take into account the fact that you're going to have challenge. These are democratic societies. Obviously, there's going to be challenge and dispute.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Barcelona. In a sense, we might sort of, as a sort of umbrella maybe movement to claim back the city. I mean, I know Barcelona's also passed a number of initiatives on Airbnb and Uber, and there's the beginnings in Barcelona of an anti-tourist movement. Finally, I mean, I think, Arthur, we're back with you. I take some of your points in roadkill. I mean, I'm very much on your side, but I'm not sure it will always work in the United States. Is there a broader politics to this that goes beyond car policy, perhaps touches on tourism and startups like Airbnb, not so much of a startup now, these sort of sharing economy technologies which revise how we think about real estate and ownership? Is there a broader political movement here?
I think there is, Andrew. I mean, we're really at the nub of the book is this idea around freedom and this idea that we think that one should be able to drive and have the option to drive, but not the obligation to. And Americans and like all people around the world love freedom and like love the feeling of that as well. And we argue that the car industrial complex has tried to hem some of that in. And in the same way that, when the first people to kind of pitch, when the guys from Airbnb first pitched it, people kind of thought this was crazy, staying in a stranger's couch or air mattress, and paying a bit less than a hotel seems like such a bonkers idea that it's what will be the benefit to it and where's the value add. And it seems very risky and dangerous.
And the same with Uber, that we would get in someone else's car.
And the same with Uber. So I think this idea of moving towards a model of shared mobility, which is a big, strong trend and will hopefully continue, and access over ownership is a really good step. It should help reduce the gross tonnage of car in the world. I think some of the early studies are suggesting that actually that's not exactly what's happening. I mean, from a study from some of the metadata from Uber and Lyft, for example, showed that they're actually idling, i.e. traveling around but without a passenger, for around 60% of the time. And if you then extrapolate that out into a scenario when there's going to be wider use of driverless cars or semi-supervised vehicle fleets, then that cost of idling is going to become even lower. So it'll be and the time of the percentage of idling is going to be even higher. And so it's going to be interesting the impact that this is going to have on congestion, on pollution, on how we design our cities, on where people choose to live, and then in turn the stuff that we're really kind of the center of this book is around the cost of living crisis and around how the car is.
Yeah, so broader conversation. Let's end with Henrietta. Would it be fair to say, Henrietta, that we are juxtaposing two kinds of freedom, 20th and 21st century freedom, and that 20th century freedom was built around the car and the idea that we should all have the right to drive wherever we wanted, whenever we wanted, and we need to rethink freedom in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's absolutely what the book argues. And we say, you can think that the car is convenient, but how convenient is it to have carbon in the bodies of unborn children? How convenient is it that young men in those big cities in the world are now, because of air pollution, about half as fertile as their grandfathers were? How convenient are these kinds of things? What constraints on freedom are there that we've imposed on ourselves? And have we really understood how the car is sold to us as always maximizing our freedoms, but is it actually constraining them as well?
There you have it. Freedom isn't really freedom, especially when it comes to cars. That's the argument in a really interesting new book. And seems to be a number of these books are rather like car traffic. Roadkill, unveiling the true cost of our toxic relationship with cars, by Henrietta Moore and Arthur Kay. Arthur in New York, Henrietta in London. Thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. And good luck. I hope, I would love to see cars banned, but what do I know? Thank you so much.
Thank you.